Avesta yesterday,
Yes.
Borlänge today, and Sundsvall tomorrow. And another person who has been thrown into this is Erik Jansson. He sits over there. He's the co-driver. You're the driver.
It's moral support.
Yes. So, Atea,
Yes.
you want to have the tasting now, so let's start.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I don't think that many people will wait to drink this whiskies in front of them for much longer, so probably get better to
Sorry,
start.
can I take one more thing?
Yes, go on.
Det här är ovana att stå här. Telefon. Stäng av telefonen. Ni vet att det kostar pengar om det ringer. 69 öl. Tänk dig att gå upp till Bengan och säga jag vill ha 69 öl ner till provningslokalen. Sätt det på min nota. Sorry.
Thank you. Thanks very much for the introduction. Let me just get our presentation up. I just wanted to show you a little bit of the distillery through one of the videos that we've uploaded this morning. It's as natural as it can get. So thanks everybody for being here tonight. I'm the brand manager, as I was introduced for. I also am the brand ambassador for Kilchoman Distillery. I started last year in September, and it's pretty new to me as well because I've been there for about a year. So if you have any questions tonight, just feel free to ask. I'll ask you to share your impressions about the whiskey. What do you think across the night? So don't be shy. And let's get started. So I don't know how many of you know Kilchoman, but we are Isla's only farm distillery and also the smallest distillery on the island to date. It was founded in 2005 by Anthony Wales, the father of Peter, James and George, and his wife Kathy. They always been linked to the island because Kathy is from there, she's from there. And Anthony was working in the wine sector for quite a long time and he started to get into independent bottling and closer to whiskey. And he found out that to find whiskey in plus a whiskey that was peated, it was getting harder and harder. So at the beginning of 2000, he started to look around and started to think about having his own distillery. And by chatting to people on the island, in 2002, he came around Kilchoman. Well, it wasn't really Kilchoman at the time, it was the farm. So in the same area where the distillery is built now, there was a farm, which is still standing to date, which is called Rockside. That was the ideal place to build the distillery because it had a very fertile land and he always wanted to grow his own malt to produce whiskey. And also the spaces, the areas around the distillery were ideal to build in it the distillery. So he started to bring in all of the equipment after received the approval to go ahead, and in 2005 he started distilling. He wasn't alone across this. He started by himself as an independent business, which still is an independent business, helped by his mentor, James Swan, which was always by his side creating and shaping the distillery for what it is today. So in the initial years, it was pretty hard for Anthony to get all the cash that is needed to run a distillery, to build it as well. So it took him about 3 years to get the funds to open the distillery after selling his own house. He moved to Isla, and after starting distilling, he started seeing running costs as well. So he approached individual people and started selling cask around to maintain this business completely independent. When it came to the initial distillations and the way the distillery was set up, was always set up to be a distillery that was able to produce whiskey in a very short period of time. So 3 years and 1 day to be called whiskey. So to do that, to release a whiskey after 3 years, he needed the help of Jim to create this spirit, very light spirit. And the first time they tried the spirit through the stills, Jim said to Anthony that he was going to be ready to bottle a whiskey after 3 years. The whiskey was going to be ready right after. And so it was. So in 2009, 2010, there were the first bottlings. But obviously the distillery was still a very small distillery. The initial production was about 60,000 litres. And the initial bottlings were actually bottled with a teapot. So every single bottle was hand-filled. That's how, genuine the production was, and it still is, but not to that stage. We're going to be starting with the first one, with Macker Bay, which is the first co-range release of the distillery. This is very much a whiskey that shows the entity and the profile of the distillery in every sort of way. It's a very light whiskey. It's a 50 ppm, so it's peated, heavily peated in this case. But there's much more to it than just peat. Whenever we are distilling, we're making sure that we are capturing all the lighter alcohols, all the citrus note, and these are showing in your glass just now. Macker Bay is 46%. It's bottled at that sort of strength to maintain a non-chill filtration. So we don't do any chill filtration, so you'll have all the fatty acids within your whiskey. If you decide to add a little bit of water to it, it might become a bit hazy, but it won't change the quality of your dram. And also, there's no colour added. So for example, this one, it's quite of a light coloured whiskey. So you would imagine it's done a majority of bourbon maturation, and in this case is a 90% bourbon maturation and a 10% sherry, ex-sherry. The average maturation for Macker Bay can vary between 3 and 5 years old, so it's a fairly young whiskey, but it doesn't show this in your glass. It's a very bold, a very fruity character, and also the smoky notes are present, and they're creating a long, lingering finish to it. So, Slange? Very, very easy to drink. A little bit of peatiness, a little bit of seasidey notes on the palate. It's almost like standing on a beach. And that's where Kilchoman takes his name, well, the Macker Bay takes his name. Kilchoman is located just a few miles from Berladec, and it's the only distillery which is not located on the seaside, on the shore. But just a kilometre down the road, you'll see a beautiful bay, which is called Macker Bay. And it takes its name from this place because it's a beautiful place, loads of waves, the smell of the ocean, and it's something that you can really see in your glass, in your whiskey. So the idea around the distillery was obviously having its own malt and creating everything from start to finish. So to do that, obviously, we grow our own malt on the farm, and we have about 110 acres at the moment, which we use for barley growing. But we also have all of the equipment to do every single step of the process on site. So we saw the malt round about April, May, depending by the weather, and at the back end of August, we harvest our own production. It's then moved into storage and then steeped and onto the malting floor. We steep it for around 48 hours with 2 washes of water. So that creates the impression for the grains to be in spring, and it just gets to that stage to think that it's time to germinate. And germination is really important for us because a good and even germination creates loads of sugar, which is really important to get good quality alcohol. So our malting floor is about 4 tons, and it's a recent one. So we built it in 2019. It's a manual malting floor, so we don't have any equipment in there. So if you've seen the picture and if you've seen the videos that I played earlier, there's always our team that is turning the malt to ensure a consistent germination across every single grain across the floor. And the height of the grains can change, the height of the bed can change depending by the season. So during summer we have a nice, even and long spread bed, which is a signal that it's quite warm and it doesn't need as much heat that is created by the malt. And during winter it can come up to 60 centimeters just to maintain all the heat that germination produce to kickstart and to finish earlier as well the germination. And this was the old kiln, which probably most of you, if you visited the distillery, have managed to have a look around. But this is actually the reason why you're tasting Macker Bay and you're tasting a whiskey that is not actually made with our own malt. Because back in 2006, Peter and I think it was James, or probably all of the 3 brothers, were watching a rugby game and forgot to turn the kiln, and a fire started. So we were left with no kiln for a few weeks. And it was initial times, it was 2006, so the distillery would have been open for just a few months. So Anthony thought that's the time to go and talk to the guys at Portland Malting and see if we can get some good stuff. So they got a batch of the 50 ppm malt that they produced there. The barley, it's sourced around the UK, but the peat is local, so it still has that entity, that sort of link to the area. And that's how they came up with Macker Bay. The first time that they ran it through the stills, thinking that it was the same recipe as, for example, Arabic, they found out that through the process that we do for distillation, everything changed. It wasn't as peated, it wasn't as smoky, it was lighter, it was floral, and it still had that entity of smoke, but not as much. So we introduced the 50 ppm malt back then, and it was a success. So it became part of our core range with Macker Bay and Sanig. And as you can see here, this is not obviously just for show, but this is a picture of our field. Because we're an operational farm, we have about 2,200 acres of land around the distillery. We're the 2nd biggest employer on the island, but we are the smallest distillery. So most of the work is obviously getting done by the farm. And it's really important for the distillery to have that side, obviously not just for the malt production, because it's a big part, but also because that's what farmers were doing back in the days. They were farming, they would have, an harvest of malt, and with the leftover of malt that we use over the winter, they would start to distill and make sure that they were preserving this malt and they were using it in a good way, mostly to keep warm. So it's very much on to keeping alive this tradition and creating a whiskey that is made entirely on the island. So starting from the malting floor, so after germination is completed, which is usually about 5 days during summer and 7 days, up to 7 days during winter, we move the malt onto a conveyor belt. The conveyor belt brings the barley into the kiln, which is the place where we stop germination with peat smoke and then with just warm air. The peat smoke, it's light up with locally sourced peat, which one of our maltmen sourced locally from his house, which is just located 3 kilometers round about that from the distillery, which is on the other side of Loch Gore. So everything comes from the island, and every single step of the process is made on the island. So after the infusion of peat for 10 hours, we then move for 48 hours into hot air. At that stage, the barley will be around about 5%, 4 to 5% moist. So it's good to be stored for a good month before being processed. So after that, we grind the malt and then we move it into mashing. Mashing is very important. It's the first time that the grain is actually getting extracted from the sugar and starts to create the wort. We do that by using 3 jets of water, which they have 3 different temperatures. So we start at 65 degrees up to 85 degrees. And from that, we collect 100% of the sugar present in the mash. Following that, we move it into the fermentation tanks, and the fermentation tanks at the moment, after the work that we've done at the distillery, we have about 12 fermentation tanks, which is pretty big considering that we started only with a few. But the reason for such a growth was very much because we have a new still house, basically, which is mirroring the old one. And we have to have the same amount of washbacks to create the same number of distillation across the week. The fermentation, it's where the alcohol starts to show, and we do that by adding yeast to the wort. The yeast that we use is a pressed yeast, which is called Maori, and we add about 20 kilograms for 6,000 litre of wort. That's where the magic begins, because we have a first fermentation, which is an anaerobic fermentation, and it has oxygen. Then it moves into an anaerobic fermentation, and then everything stops for a few hours. But then we have already 8% of alcohol, which is what we need for distillation, basically. But we haven't achieved the flavor yet. We haven't achieved what we want yet. So we keep it there, but we leave time to his thing. So a secondary fermentation starts. This is a bacteria that is attracted by the wash and start the secondary fermentation. It doesn't add any additional alcohol to it, but it creates lighter notes, more on the fruity side, on the floral side, that otherwise the wash wouldn't have. So after 80 hours, which is double the distillery's standards, we are ready to start distillation. But with that, I would suggest you to grab your second dram. This is SMAD. As you can see, we have a much darker colored whiskey. As for Maker Bay, we haven't added any sort of color to it, so this is all coming from the cask. Maker Bay and SMAD have the same type of new make, so they use 50 ppm malt. for the distillation, and they have the same type of casks that they've been used, just in different percentages. So you'll find here 70% of ex-sherry Oloroso hogshead, so 250 litre hogshead, and 30% bourbon casks. So a completely different feel to it. A very warm, very intense flavour. So cooked fruit, spices, sultanas, chocolates. It's very, very intense at the same time, very light. So you don't get as many notes of smokiness as you would get in Michael Bay, for example. But in this case, you get a little bit of barbecue sauce, that hint of smokiness, but very sweet. Dried meats, for example. And this one is also a 46%, so it's kind of light on the palate. I'm saying that because we're having up to 56% tonight, so. Lots of spices on the palate. A very smooth and round flavour. It does have that sort of lovely, I think it's me, baby. I think it's me, but anyway. It does have that chocolatey note, a bit of a drier sort of finish given by the sherry. But it's very, very intense, very, very smooth, very palatable. It is one of the higher percentage of sherry that we use across the releases, just beaten by our Loch Gore, which is a limited release, which we release every single year. So it's returning an unlimited release, which is matured in ex-sherry bots, so the 500 litres barrels. And it's obviously a different entity and a different profile. So when we're talking about the hogshead, we're talking about much more contact with the wood, so much more extraction, much more notes of the sherry coming through. And this is something that it's very much changed with Sanig over the course of the last 2 years. In 2020, the beginning of 2020, we had a very active delivery of casks in terms of, they were really active casks that we received from Bodega Miguel Martin, which is our supplier. They just had another level of strength to it, and this really shows not only on the color, but also on the palate and on the nose. Which I found really, really different from the 2019 one, for example. Chocolate is very, very present, it's all I can see tonight. But also when it opens up, it does have those notes of vanilla and white fruits that we have experienced in Michael Bay before. Bit of freshness as well is very well balanced with it. And the sherry that we use, because it's Oloroso, it's a medium dry sherry, so it tends to give sort of a sweetness to it, but without being overly sweet. So the presentation is reminding me that I haven't told you about the stills. So our stills are probably the smallest stills on the island. Our wash still is 3,250 litres, while our spirit still is only about 2,300. We charge the wash still with 3,000 litres of wash, which gets pumped from the wash bags onto the wash still. And we run the distillation for about 5 hours to collect the low wines. As you can see, it has coil in it to heat up the wash, and then obviously creates this separation of the alcohol from the watery part of the wash. After that, we collect it into the low wine receiver, and then we mix it, which is about 1,000 litre that we receive from the 3,000 litre that we first charged with. And then we receive the faints, the faints from the previous distillation, from the spirit still, and charge again the spirit still for the second distillation. From there, we collect 5 minutes of 4 shots, which is a very, very short 4 shots. And then for an hour and a half, we collect the new make. It's a very slow distillation in a very small still, so there's quite a lot of copper content. And we tend to cut it, we always cut it actually, at 65.5%. So we take away all the heavier parts, the fainty and oily parts. But what it helps us is very much this part here, the reflux bulb. The reflux bulb, it's aiming to create even more contact with the copper and even more reflux. So that helps bringing down the heavier alcohols and making sure that we're distilling and collecting only the lighter ones. So that's what creates this citrus and floral aroma, actually what selects the citrus and floral aroma. Because otherwise we could have an oily and a peatier sort of whiskey, which we can do, but it's not what we're aiming to. So after we cut at 65.5%, there is all the faints that are getting collected, which they count for about 40%. And we move on to putting the new make into cask. But before doing that, we lower the level to 63.5% to get the maturation started. We basically fill about 70% of bourbon casks, first fill and refill, and then about 20% of sherry cask. Everything else, it's experimental, it's wine cask, different things, some of them which we're going to be trying tonight. So, talking about experimental ones, I would suggest you to go to your third glass, which is the Madeira matured. Number 3. Number 6 for later. So for this one, as you can see, the color is very, very different. It's almost like a pink color to it. Madeira is a fortified wine, which is coming back on trend in restaurants and bars, but also with the whiskey industry. So this whiskey has been matured only in Madeira for 5 years. 5 years and a few months, actually. We have used only hogshead for this one, and I can tell you that we used 46 hogshead to create 17,000 bottles. It is very special because compared to the one that we've tried before, we're talking about a 50% alcohol, so a higher level of alcohol. But also we don't have the same type of casks in it. Most of the times you will find finishes in Madeira or just a bit of a longer finish. It's very, very hard you find a solely matured in Madeira. So just to give you a bit of a preview, you will expect to have a bit of a drier and oxidized sort of note on the nose. It's very fruity. You get quite a lot of dried fruit. Don't expect as much sweetness as we've seen in SMAD. Madeira can be quite sweet. This one might have been a medium dry cask, well, type of cask, because we had 46. But on the palate, it's where it shows the best from my point of view. It does have loads of notes of nuts, especially walnuts, chocolate and cooked fruit. And especially the finish, it seems that, you know, using a drier sort of cask and not having as much sweetness as we had in SMAD helps keeping high the level of smokiness. So expect a much smokier whiskey than the previous one. Cheers. Few spices as well on top of the walnuts. Very, very different, very distinguished compared to the initial ones that we've tried. And the wine, the Madeira, is really showing that oxidized note. That sweet and perfumey note is always there, but without overshading the spirit character that we've tried in Macabee and SMAD. What do you all think? I see a lot of different faces doing. Do you like it? Is that the first time you're trying a full maturation in Madeira? Most of you? So Madeira, it's a wine that comes from obviously the island of Madeira. The cask that we buy, they get shipped to Portugal, to Diaz. And that's where we buy our Madeira and also our SDR, which we'll talk about later. But these two obviously have a link. They come from the same supplier. And we rely on a few suppliers for our casks. So we talked about bourbon being our main type of wood for aging. And it's very much the rule around the distillery to age in bourbon casks. So we buy these casks from Buffalo Trace in Kentucky. And we started buying them just a few years after we started producing, because it took Anthony a few years to convince Buffalo Trace to sell to us. But the quality of their cask, it's outstanding. And it's a very, very consistent flavor that gives our casks. So whenever we're doing a batch of Macabee, we can always make sure that they're going to be pretty similar after 3, 4, 5, or 6 years. And that really helps us as a small distillery to keep on with the demand of our core range whiskies. And in terms of the sherry, we buy casks directly from Jerez in Spain. So that helps us to have the best quality sherry, but also sherry that has wood that has seen sherry maturing in it for a minimum of 3 years. The demand for sherry in the whiskey business is now very, very high. So most of the quality that you can find, most of the type of cask that you can find, it's usually casks that have seen sherry seasoning rather than sherry maturations. So the maturation really stands out, and it really shows the color and the quality that it gives to these whiskies. And then we have mezcals, we have tequilas, we have loads of different type of experimental casks. We recently bought Marsala, Maori, and these are obviously the limited releases and the single cask that you're probably going to be seeing in 4 or 5 years, depending how things go and if they work out, obviously. But as you've seen probably from the pictures, our warehouses are traditional Danish warehouses. So we only move the casks by hand. We have only 3 rows, and this is very much to guarantee a really stable and a really consistent maturation all across. As for all of the rest of the process, we do everything by hand. So we make sure that every single cask is obviously stored correctly, taste is good as well because it's part of the job, and also is moved by our guys whenever we need to get it bottled. So this is very much on to the production, and with that I will leave you a good 10 minutes to get a break before we move on to single cask and the original cask strength. If you have any questions, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be around, so just stop me, don't be shy. All right? See you soon.